This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 458 of the Late Round Podcast, with many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. So just to remind all of you, I know your trade deadlines have passed. They're gone. I still do have some buy and sell recommendations this week, but it's not to just say, go trade for this player. It's to say, hey, maybe you should have confidence in this guy moving forward, or hey, you might want to temper your expectations. With just two more of these to go after this week, I'll be focused more on ads and drops moving forward. But for this week, we've got a handful of buys and sells too. Now, before getting into the transactions, I want to let you know that the World Fantasy Football Championship is live on FanDuel, and although this year's final won't take place in person, there's still plenty to be excited about. To earn your chance at Fantasy Glory, simply enter a World Fantasy Football Championship qualifier. If you finish in first place, you'll qualify for the WFFC Online Finals and get access to some very special virtual experiences, including virtual meet and greets with NFL legends, cool watch parties with extra prizes and giveaways, and free games to win FanDuel prizes. Time is running out on qualifying, so head to FanDuel and enter today. For more details, visit FanDuel.com/WFFC or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Hold Justin Herbert. So Justin Herbert's had an awesome rookie season. He's basically been automatic for most of this 2020 campaign. He got his first start in week 2, and from that point through week 11, he averaged over 24 points per game, and he dropped below 20 points just once. But over the last 2 weeks, things haven't been as good. Week 12, Herbert had 16.4 points, and then on Sunday, he was terrible. He had 4.4 fantasy points. Now, maybe this is the start of a downward spiral. Maybe defenses have figured out Justin Herbert. But the good news is that the Chargers get the Falcons, Raiders, and Broncos through the end of the fantasy season. None of those teams are scary matchups when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. And Atlanta, in particular, is the top matchup in the league. So I do think Herbert is going to be very usable still down the stretch. Buy Ryan Tannehill. So again, I know you can't trade for Ryan Tannehill right now. I know your trade deadlines have passed. But Tannehill's been playing really well. He has 3 straight really strong performances, and I think that's going to continue through the fantasy playoffs. Now, I've alluded to the Tennessee Titans schedule earlier this season when talking about Derrick Henry. And Derrick Henry can still win some fantasy leagues this year, despite his Week 13 performance. But that doesn't mean the Tennessee passing attack isn't going to do well. Week 14, they get Jacksonville. That's a team that ranks as the 5th most advantageous matchup in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. And then in Week 15, they get the Lions. They're the 13th easiest. Tannehill has been up and down this season from a fantasy perspective. But I think he's going to finish strong, as is this entire Tennessee passing attack. Drop Darius Slayton. So with any recommendation that I give you guys, of course it needs league context. If you're in a 16-team deep league, you probably don't need to drop Darius Slayton. There's probably not a better alternative sitting on your waiver wire. But if you're in a 10-team league or maybe even a 12-team league, you can probably drop him at this point. He hasn't given us a top 20 performance since week 5 against Dallas, and since Sterling Shepard returned, Slayton's seen his target share per game rate go from 23.7% to 12.3%. He's now seen fewer than 6% of the Giants' targets over the last 2 weeks. Regardless of the matchup, I don't know how you're going to trust Darius Slayton in the fantasy playoffs. Add Keke Coutee. So I talked about Keke Coutee on last week's show, and then he exceeded all expectations in week 13. Even though he was an ad, he still did way better than I thought he was going to do. Without Will Fuller in that lineup this past week, Coutee saw 24.3% of the Texans' targets, he caught 8 passes, and he had 141 yards. But here's the thing that was really good to see. In 2019, Coutee's average depth of target was just 7.6. That's according to Pro Football Focus. The year before that, his rookie season, it was 4.7. He had always seen targets closer to the line of scrimmage. But on Sunday, it was 13.4. 4 of his 9 targets traveled 15 or more air yards. If he's going to be used more down the field, he's got a chance to be a legitimate starter for the fantasy football playoffs. The thing is, the Texans' schedule isn't ideal. That's not great, but Coutee should absolutely be rostered. And in deeper leagues, you can add Chad Hansen too. He saw almost 19% of Houston's targets, and he was the number 3 pass catcher on that team. By the Cleveland Browns defense. So the Browns are still rostered in just 38% of Yahoo leagues. You guys might remember about a month ago when I talked about adding the Browns defense. Because not only was their immediate schedule good, not only were they a streamer that week, but their playoff schedule was good too. In weeks 14 through 16, they get the Ravens, Jets, and the Giants. Now, you might not want to play them against the Ravens this week, I get it. But against the Jets and the Giants, they're a great play. Both of those teams are top 10 matchups for opposing defenses when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. So if the Browns are on your waiver wire, you can add them. And if you have the Browns on your roster, good for you. Add Ty Johnson. Frank Gore left the Jets game against the Raiders on Sunday after just 1 carry because he got a concussion. And that opened things up a whole lot for Ty Johnson. He had 71% of the team's running back rushes and a 10% target share. He also saw 7 of a possible 8 running back rushes in the red zone. And he had 4 or 5 rushes at the goal line. So after going for over 100 yards, he might have bought himself some playing time, even if Frank Gore comes back. Sell Cam Newton. Honestly, it's just really tough to feel confident in Cam Newton entering the fantasy playoffs. That's what this is all about. He's coming off a top 10 performance in week 13. He scored some fantasy points. But he's also now had back-to-back games without reaching 100 yards passing. He's just getting by on these rushing touchdowns. And he's doing that a lot. He's finding the end zone on the ground a lot. He has 11 rushing touchdowns this year. But that also makes him a really volatile play. In games where Newton's not found the end zone on the ground, he's ranked as a QB 28, 36, 14, and 31 in weekly scoring. That can absolutely torpedo your week. And over the next 2 weeks, he's got the Rams and the Dolphins. Those are 2 teams that rank in the top half of the league in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. The Rams especially are a tough matchup. By the Detroit Lions passing attack. So the Lions played their first game this season without Matt Patricia, and they looked better and more competent offensively. They at least looked more fun because they got back to their 2019 ways when Matthew Stafford was pacing for his best season of his career. Let's flash back to last season. That was Darrell Bevell's first season as Detroit's offensive coordinator. Stafford threw it 15 or more air yards last year on 26.1% of his attempts. That was the highest mark among relevant quarterbacks. So far in 2020, we haven't seen that from Stafford. Going into Sunday's game against the Bears, his deep ball rate was just 15.2%. So basically 11 percentage points lower than what he saw last year. But get this, on Sunday, with Darrell Bevell now as interim head coach, Stafford chucked it deep on 31% of his throws. That was a season high. Now maybe this is all just a coincidence, because the Lions were in a negative game script, maybe they liked the matchup, and they just went for it. They just threw it deep. Or maybe this is the result of a culture change. The Lions just went from a head coach who wanted a more conservative approach to one who has a history of throwing the ball deep. And in situations like this, when there's a narrative that does actually make sense, I'm okay with buying into that narrative a little bit. I'm okay with buying into the fact that we might see down the stretch here this Detroit Lions offense look more like the 2019 version than the 2020 version. And there's a decent playoff schedule here too. And Kenny Golladay might come back. All of that combined makes me want to buy into this offense. Add Cole Kmet. So on last week's matchup show on the Late Round Podcast, I talked about Cole Kmet as being a deeper streamer. And he came through. Now, one of the main reasons I liked Kmet was because he was running more routes than Jimmy Graham over the last couple of games for Chicago. He had taken over as the tight end 1 in that offense. This past week, he ran 20 routes, Jimmy Graham ran 15. 2 weeks ago, he ran 33 routes, Jimmy Graham ran 17. And then the game before that, it was 18 to 15. Cole Kmet was the tight end 1. And then finally it hit. Finally, things came together. This is why we look at peripheral numbers. Because on Sunday, he had a 21.1% target share in that Chicago offense. And he found the end zone. Now, because the tight end position is so bad, he's probably worth an add off the waiver wire this week. Drop Boston Scott. So I talked a lot about handcuffs on last week's mailbag show. You guys can go back and listen to that if you missed it last week. One of the things that I mentioned is that you always have to evolve the way that you view handcuffs. How we viewed a guy at the beginning of the season is not how we should view that same player right now, because things change. Tony Pollard, for instance, he was one of the best handcuffs in fantasy football. Now that's not really the case because Dak Prescott is no longer the quarterback. That offense is not the same. And you could make a similar argument for Boston Scott right now. When Miles Sanders missed time earlier this season, Boston Scott was serviceable. He had some good outings. But the Philadelphia offense just keeps getting worse and worse. And look, I'm optimistic about Jalen Hurts. I definitely like him under center more than Carson Wentz. But I'm also just trying to be realistic here. The Eagles' offensive line has not been very good. And then on Sunday, Jordan Howard entered the picture. They elevated him off the practice squad. He played 18% of their snaps and he had 25% of the team's running back rushes. Corey Clement was not consistently hitting that mark week in and week out. So if Jordan Howard starts doing that, that means if Miles Sanders goes down, Boston Scott is not the main handcuff. Or at the very least, what I should say is he's going to split that backfield with Jordan Howard. And that really lessens the appeal for Boston Scott. That's the main reason you can drop him. Add Jalen Hurts. So speaking of Jalen Hurts, like I said, I'm optimistic about what he can bring to this Philadelphia offense. Now the thing is, they get the Saints this week. You probably can't use Jalen Hurts against the Saints. Because over the second half of the season, this New Orleans defense has been playing a lot better. They haven't allowed a top 12 QB1 performance since week 5. But here's the thing. You add Jalen Hurts this week, you see how he does, and then you might be able to play him in weeks 15 and 16. Because they get Arizona and Dallas. Those are two good matchups for a quarterback. And remember, Jalen Hurts doesn't have to light it up through the air in order to be fantasy relevant. Because he can run the ball. We love that cheat code in fantasy football. He carried the ball 5 times for 29 yards against the Packers on Sunday. And that was in relief of Carson Wentz. He didn't start that game. So add Jalen Hurts this week. Probably don't play him. See how he does. And then you might have a quarterback starter for weeks 15 and 16. Add Mitchell Trubisky. Mitch Trubisky kind of works this week because he gets Houston. Houston's secondary is so bad. Especially now that Bradley Roby is no longer in that secondary. In 2 games without Roby this year, Houston's allowed Jake Luton and Phillip Rivers to combine for 589 yards and 3 touchdowns. And this past Sunday, Rivers was 6th across the league in both expected points per dropback and success rate. Success rate measures the percentage of dropbacks that resulted in positive expected points plays. So even though this over-under isn't very high, this game environment isn't unbelievable, it's a plus matchup for Trubisky. And he's coming off a relatively solid game against Detroit, despite what he did at the end of that game. Add Phillip Rivers. So speaking of Phillip Rivers, he continues to not get enough love in the fantasy football world. I bring him up on basically every matchup show now. He's averaged over 18 points per game over his last 7 games. He's now ranked worse than QB 13 in weekly scoring just once over this time. And that was against a really good Baltimore defense. Now he gets the Raiders this week and then the Texans again next week. Vegas is a pretty good matchup when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. And the Texans, like I just said, they're struggling against the pass. They struggled against Phillip Rivers this past Sunday. So I like adding Rivers now, and you can realistically play him in weeks 14 and 15. Add the Carolina Panthers defense. So the Panthers had a bye this past week, and now they're available in 94% of Yahoo leagues. That definitely makes them a streaming option. As does the fact that they're facing Denver. The Broncos are the second best opponent for fantasy defenses this year when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. Defenses have scored 3.3 more standard points against the Broncos than their season-long averages. Now, there is a coronavirus situation happening with Carolina right now, so definitely monitor that. But if all things look good, they're a streamer this week. Add the Arizona Cardinals defense. Now, one defense that might be a little bit safer than Carolina is Arizona. They're 3-point favorites and they get the Giants this week. And even though New York got a big win against Seattle in week 13, the Seahawks defense still posted a pair of sacks and they had an interception. Now, we don't know if Daniel Jones is going to be back, but if he is back, the Giants aren't any worse of a matchup. Across the entire season, they've been the 9th friendliest opponent when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to defenses. The 16 transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to add or hold T.Y. Hilton and Michael Pittman Jr. I was more on Michael Pittman this past week than Hilton because I thought Pittman offered more upside. and he had been seeing a more consistent target share in that Colts offense. But Hilton was the guy who blew up. He had a 31% target share against Houston. He balled out. Pittman was at 14.3%. But Pittman still has about a 17% target share since becoming more involved in this offense. And like I noted with the Colts, they get the Raiders and the Texans over their next 2 games. So if either of these wide receivers are on your waiver wire, you should add them if you need wide receiver help. And if you have them, I wouldn't drop them because of this schedule. All right, I was going to cut it off with that 16th transaction, and then the Monday night games happened, and Antonio Gibson got hurt. So I'm adding this little audio clip to remind you guys to give Peyton Barber a look off the waiver wire, assuming J.D. McKissic is already rostered. Barber saw 14 carries, he scored a touchdown against the Steelers, and he would serve as the early down guy for Washington if Gibson misses time. I had to add this so that you guys knew that he's someone to look for off the waiver wire this week as well. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow.